John Edward Wansbrough was an American historian who taught at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. By his fundamental criticism of the historical credibility of the classical Islamic narratives concerning Islam's beginnings and his attempt to develop an alternative, historically more credible version of Islam's beginnings, Wansbrough founded the so-called revisionist School of Islamic Studies. Life. Wansbrough was born in Peoria, Illinois. He completed his studies at Harvard University, and spent the rest of his academic career at SOAS. He died at Montaigu de Quercy, France. Among his students were Andrew Rippin, Norman Calder, Gerald R. Horting, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. Research. Wansbrough began studying early Islamic manuscripts and the Quran. He realized that the early Islamic texts addressed an audience which was familiar with Jewish and Christian texts, and that Jewish and Christian theological problems were discussed. Criticism of infidels was addressed obviously to monotheists who did not live monotheism purely. These observations did not fit to the Islamic narratives on Islam's beginnings, which depicted Islam to come into being within a polytheistic society. Wansbrough analyzed the classical Islamic narratives which had been written 150 to 200 years after Muhammad with the historical critical method, especially literary criticism. Thus, he claimed countless proofs that these texts are not historical accounts but later literary constructions in the sense of the concept of a salvation history of the Old Testament. The historical core is meager and cannot be detected. On this basis, Wansbrough developed the theory that Islam did not come into being as a new religion on its own but derived from conflicts of various Jewish-Christian sects. The Quran was written and collected in a long process over 200 years and thus cannot be attributed to Muhammad. The person of Muhammad would be later invention, or at least Muhammad cannot be related to the Quran. For later times, Muhammad had only the function to provide an own identity to the new religious movement according to the role model of a prophet of the Old Testament. Reception and critique. By his fundamental criticism of the historical credibility of the classical Islamic narratives concerning Islam's beginnings and his attempt to develop an alternative, historically more credible version of Islam's beginnings, Wansbrough founded the so-called revisionist School of Islamic Studies. His influence cannot be overestimated, yet Wansbrough's theory is today considered to be too radical in detail, especially in the total separation of the emergence of the Quran from the person of Muhammad. However, Wansbrough's rejection of the classical Islamic narratives as historical accounts widely finds acceptance. Also, his realization that Islam came into being within a milieu shaped as strongly influenced by Jews and Christians is broadly supported. Publications. Quranic studies, sources and methods of scriptural interpretation. The sectarian milieu, content and composition of Islamic salvation history. Res ipsa locuta, history and mimesis. Lingua franca in the Mediterranean. Res ipsa locuta, history and mimesis. This line of research was investigated in Egypt by Nasser Abu Zaid, but he was expelled from Egypt because of his conclusions about the Quran. Students and scholars who doubt the traditional view of the genesis of the Quran as well. Michael Cook, Patricia Crone, Martin Hines, Gerald Horting, Christoph Luxemburg, Gerda Queen, Andrew Rippin. Bibliography. Carlos A. Segovia and Basil Luria eds. The Coming of the Comforter, When, Where, and to Whom. Studies on the Rise of Islam and Other Various Topics in Memory of John Wansbrough. Orientalia Judaica Christiana 3. Piscataway, N.J., Gorges Press, 2012. ISBN 9781463201586-6.